I mainly think of Dan as a friend, but of course, he's also a very well-known, renowned scholar. So just to give you a little sense of his background in case you don't know, Dan's the executive director of the Mindsight Institute and co-founder, and founder of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, where he was the co-principal investigator of the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development and clinical professor of psychiatry at the School of Medicine. So that's basically to say he's got street cred. he's has his academic positions, but he's also a best-selling author. He's written so many books and they've really touched the larger culture he writes in this really accessible, fascinating way. And he's written more books than even he has read, than I have read, that probably as anyone has read. He's written lots of books, 15 at least, which have been translated into over 40 languages. Many of his books are New York Times bestsellers. He graduated Harvard Medical School, did his training in pediatrics, adult, adolescent, and child psychiatry. He's actually an MD. He's a medical doctor. So even though he does psychiatry. And basically, the recent years, his work is focused on how relationships really impact not only how we make sense of the world, but also how our brain functions. So he's the father of a field that he actually founded the field called Interpersonal Neurobiology, which explores the interaction of the brain, the mind, and interpersonal relationships. And lately, and this is where we're going to touch it a little bit tonight, he's been very interested. Actually, he's always been interested in this, but lately he's been writing about this concept of intra-connection. Actually, his latest book is called Intra-Connected. It's about the integration of the sense of me and other people in a concept he calls we, MWE, and really interested in how understanding the boundaries of the self and whether or not those boundaries are as firm and clear and separate as we think they are, how that influences so many things, our awareness, and also we're going to talk about tonight, our sense of self-compassion. So anyway, that's a long way of saying Dan is, I have to just say, if you ever hear Dan talk, I have pretty good self-confidence, but whenever I hear Dan talk at a public event, I'm always like, wow, I wish I was that brilliant. He's just really a brilliant person in so many ways, and a very nice, kind person as well. Okay, so now you're probably totally beat red, aren't you, Dan? Although you're used to people speaking highly of you, but I can see that you're also a little embarrassed here. So I wanted to ask you as the first question, how has self-compassion played a role kind of in your personal journey? We're going to talk about how the role it plays in your work, but what about in your personal journey, in your personal life? I know you've had a long history with the idea and practice of self-compassion.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kristin, and thank you everyone for being here. And Kristin, thank you for inviting me to join your community. And thank you for your really wonderful work. That's such a beautiful contribution to our professional lives and our personal lives. So really, let's hear it for Kristin for your great work. Yay. So the idea of being kind to your inner experience, this idea of self-compassion that you beautifully shed a light on for so many people academically and also therapeutically and in the world. When I grew up in my family, there wasn't much kindness going on that you would see interpersonally. There wasn't much insight into what was beneath people's behaviors, and there wasn't much patience for not keeping up with expectations that people might have. And there was a lot of opinionated expressions of hostility, and my mom has turned 95 this year, and she's finally given me permission to say whatever I want about my way of growing up in the family she created, because in the past, many of her friends were my students, and she begged me not to embarrass her by talking about my upbringing, because her friends would come back and say, Dan just mentioned this. And she said, please don't do that. So I said, okay, I will not do it. But now on her 95th birthday, she said, I need to let you know they're all gone. So, when you grow up in a family like that, where kindness is in short supply, then for me anyway, given my temperament, I, was very feeling like there was something really profoundly missing, but I couldn't really name it. And then when I was in college, I worked on a suicide prevention service, phone hotline kind of thing. And I didn't think, I'd be particularly with any skills, because it certainly wasn't something I learned at home. And I was a biochemistry major, so I wasn't learning it in my studies. But there, I learned that when you're on the phone, even though it's not like this where we see each other, but it's the tone of voice and the way things are said, that being kind, being caring, trying to get a sense of another person's inner life and the suffering they were going through could literally make the difference between life and death. So I think as a college student, so my late teens, it really impressed me that this wasn't like a luxury, that it may not be happening in my particular family of origin, but that it was a source of incredible relief from suffering, just to be kind, and to be caring and to be, I didn't have a word for it at the time, empathic, or really trying to say that the subjective life of oneself or another person's inner life, was really important. So when I went to medical school, I, I naively thought that would be a natural way of blending my interest in science with taking care of people. And I was shocked to find, I went to a research, medical school, Harvard, as you mentioned, so I had a lot of super intellectually gifted professors, but they were, challenged in the kindness department, let's put it that way, and challenged in the empathy department. And while they seemed to care about their work, they didn't seem to care about the people, which was just weird. And it was really upsetting. And so I became very disillusioned and despairing and kind of depressed, actually. And, I thought, well, how are you going to get out of your depression, man? I said to myself. And I said, well, don't become like those professors. So I dropped out of school. And in the course of dropping out of school, I went on a journey, through Canada and I thought about being a salmon fisherman and all sorts of things. But ultimately, when I came back to school, of course, the professors hadn't changed, but I made up this word mindsight for, what had three elements in my mind when I was still a dropout. Was you could see the inner life of the individual that was having this mindsight ability. You could get a glimpse into the inner life of another human being that wasn't in your body. And that you honored the differences, but you sought to create linkages. And I didn't know the name then, but soon I realized that that's a process called integration, where you honor differences, promote linkages. So Mindsight had those three elements, insight, empathy, and integration. And so I would study my professors like an anthropology, researcher might. Like, what's this bizarre culture called, medical socialization? And, I noticed that the patients that were lucky enough to have a clinician who had this trifecta of insight, empathy, and integration, the patients seemed to do better. And the ones that had clinicians, physicians who didn't, which was the majority of cases, they didn't seem to do so well. So when I went into pediatrics and then switched over to psychiatry, Mindsight, what for me was like a foundation for how to be a pediatrician, how to be a psychiatrist, and that's how. So So that I would say, because you didn't really push this word self-compassion until years later, but for me, the Mindsight stuff that really let me survive when I went back to school and get my professional training, that was the key. So I think I'll ask you, does any of that stuff feel like it overlaps with your journey of self-compassion?
Yeah, well, so I mean, that's the thing. So most people, when they think about even you work on interpersonal neurobiology or empathy, they usually think about having that towards other people. And yet, knowing you and just the way you talk about it, because I know when you talk about kindness, you include turning that lens inside as well as just to other people. Whereas most people, they just think about being kind to others and not to themselves. So I
Yeah,
guess I'm curious, even in reading some of your stuff, I know you talk about turning compassion inward. You don't only talk about it to other people. And then also getting back to, if you don't mind, if your mother allows us, when
yes,
you started, applying this kindness to yourself.
yeah.
So kind of that both the personal and the intellectual journey, because of course they're always
Yeah, well,
linked.
yeah, it's really interesting, and I can't wait to share with you, Kristen, and your community this new book, which I spent 20 years writing with four science colleagues to translate the Enneagram of personality into a kind of a interpersonal neurobiology framework that we call PDP, Patterns of Developmental Pathways. And basically the model in very brief is temperament drives forward from the subcortical areas of the brain, the ones beneath the higher area of the cortex. And in doing that, it's going to shape personality, which are patterns of emotion,
Mm-hmm.
it's experience and expression, thought, what matters to you, the narratives you have, and action, how you behave. So that's one way of just describing what personality is. So I'm an attachment researcher. So what I've proposed in doing the initial research is that attachment doesn't shape personality in its characteristics. It just seems, if it's non-secure versus secure, it seems to intensify personality if your attachment was non-secure. So we can get into that, but to point that out, I think I got just fortunate that in my temperament, I didn't have a predilection for a lot of harshness inwardly, even
Right.
though there was a lot of harshness in the attachment world, whether it was from my brother or my mother or my father, a lot of harshness. I just didn't do it inwardly. But when you look at this temperament business, you can see why I wouldn't be prone to that. But there are probably 2/3 of the temperament groupings. We don't talk about types, we talk about patterns,
Uh-huh.
but that would be prone to having it. So it would be interesting to do a research thing on your measure of self-compassion and the
Right.
PDP measures we're developing, that
Interesting.
in this model, 1/3 of the group probably has pretty robust, what you call self-compassion, and 2/3 may not, just innately, and non-secure attachment would intensify the lack of self-compassion for the 2/3. So anyway, it's just a subtle way of kind of, maybe subtle isn't maybe the right word, but a more nuanced way of asking the question. So for me, fortunately,
Right.
unlike people I know, are close to me, where there's a lot of harshness, I never really had that. I had other issues that were really a problem that
Yeah.
I can happy to share, but but that wasn't one of them, fortunately. I had enough to go on. Anyway, so that being said, what was confusing to me wasn't so much about the inner kindness and compassion, but was the disconnection that I grew up with in my family. And then be a biochemistry major, no one's really connecting with each other. In medical school, people started, and the research shows this, becoming less and less empathic. Um, and so I was puzzled by it. And so if you really look at the deep mechanisms, let's say, of compassion, whether it's, you know, outwardly directed, which is just simply called compassion, or inwardly directed, which you beautifully called self-compassion, that inward and outward focus of compassion and kindness, same thing. What we say at our institute, the Mindsight Institute, is integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And that's whether it's directed inward or that. So for me, when I read your beautiful work on self-compassion, it was a great example of integration, of really allowing you to differentiate some of the reactions you were having and saying, that's just human. Or,
Right.
you did this and it's okay. How would you treat your best friend, and how do you befriend yourself that way? So for
Right.
me, reading your work, it was, yeah, that was the third component of Mindsight, which was integration, because integration made visible as kindness and compassion. So it's really insight, empathy, kindness, and compassion, essentially. And so it felt very natural. And for me, it was really more about the interpersonal connection, which I was raised not to cultivate. I was educated not to develop. In medical training, it just knocked it out of you, and so I did really hard work to just build on my interpersonal relationality, which is probably why I named the field interpersonal neurobiology.
Yeah.
But it's as much about the personal, the inner, as the inter,
Well, and that's what I think that's what's so key about your work that stands out is this thing of integration, right? Because when I talk about self-compassion to people, I also often talk about treating yourself the way you treat your friends. And so for most people, they're a lot kinder to others than they are to themselves. And in one way of talking about that is it's not integrated. And so
Yeah,
because it's interpersonal integration means both ways. So treating yourself like you treat others, treating others like you would like to be treated, all that really comes from integration. So would you be willing to say that people who lack self-compassion are basically just lacking integration,
yeah,
perhaps?
I would say that for sure. What's
Yeah.
really interesting about that question, Kristen, is you then have kind of like a foundation uh, where you say, when someone is experiencing, rigidity in their lives or chaos, and that's just one thing we can get into, but when they experience that, then they have mental suffering. And so when you're harsh to your inner life, when you don't have self-compassion, you're creating both rigidity or like this, or chaos, like you bad person, and those are the ways. How do you measure a lack of integration? Is you're basically asking, where is there chaos? Where is there rigidity? And whenever there's chaos, whenever there's rigidity, amazingly, and this is now 32 years that this has been able to be kind of explored, there's impaired integration. So then you can apply it very specifically. Like, let's look at the features of self-compassion, and see, are you being mindful? Are you being gentle with yourself? Are you seeing you're part of a larger humanity? Those are really useful constructs you have. And those are all examples of, I think, integration. And that when someone doesn't have them, I'll ask you, do you see this chaos and rigidity as like the 30,000-foot view of looking down, not the details, but like that falls into those two kind of extremes outside of a river of harmony, a river of integration?
Yeah, and I've never really thought of it that way, but it makes sense now that you say it, right? So if you think of the lack of integration as either being rigid or chaotic, I think that's what often it looks like when people lack self-compassion. Either they're stuck and they're rigid in their self-use, or they're just very moody, or they're emotionally dysregulated. And one
Mm.
of the things that happens when you're kind to yourself is you start calming down, you aren't so chaotic, you're more flexible, you aren't so, identify with negative thoughts and feelings about yourself. So anyway, that's a
Beautiful.
paper we got to write someday.
Well, and now to build on that paper, everyone's seeing the paper come out in person. Let's do it,
Okay.
Kristen. I was reading this is my wonky side. I was reading this mathematics book on complex systems and years ago, and it said that there's a process called self-organization. And when complex systems, which we can get into later if you want, but anyway, when these kinds of systems are naturally unfolding, they tend to move with what's called optimal self-organization. And I won't get into the probability aspects of that, but it's
Yeah,
fascinating if you like math.
please. Yeah,
Yeah.
over
I
my
won't get
head.
into it. I won't get into it. But let's just call it optimal flow. Now
Okay.
that optimal flow
Flow.
has
Yeah.
flow. It has
Yeah.
that's like a river.
Yeah.
So it has 5 features that if you rearrange them and rename them, they spell the word faces. So you mentioned one of them. Flexibility is the F.
Uh-huh.
So when it's an optimal flow, it's flexible. Number 2 is adaptive. That means it's not only flexible, but it's meeting the contextual changes and it's adjusting accordingly. So flexible means it can bend, not break. Adaptable means it sees what's going on in the situation and changes itself to optimize its flow given context changes. C is a beautiful mathematical concept called coherence, which basically means resilience, essentially. So coherent narratives and stuff like that, which I'm a scientist of narrative, so that's what we study, coherence of narrative. Anyway, it's a resilient system. So the coherence is C. E is energized, and S is stable, which doesn't mean rigid, it means reliable. So let me ask you, are those 5 features of the integrated flow what arises with self-compassion? So flexibility, adaptability, coherence, energy, and stability.
Well, if you look at the research, certainly a flexibility. There's measures of psychological flexibility. People with more self-compassion are more flexible. I don't know if there's been any research on coherent narratives. That there may be. I'm not aware of it, so I'm not going to leave that one out. But certainly resilience. That's one of the main features of self-compassion. Is it does provide you with resilience, and the stability. So one of the ways I see self-compassion providing stability is it gives you much more stable self-worth. And there's a lot of research on that, and unlike something like self-esteem, which may be up and down depending on how things are going, it gives you that when you root your sense of self-worth in this common humanity, in something larger than yourself, and we'll come back to that, it gives you real stability.
Beautiful. And what about the energy?
The energy.
Do people have more energy when they have more self-compassion after your workshops? I know Christy says hello and she does, and Caroline says hello and she does. So I have 2 subjects who listen to you all the time.
Well, it's linked to things like optimism, less depression. So again, I don't want to pretend that there's, my observation is yes. I can't say for sure there's research on that, but my observation is yes, because it's so draining when you're shaming yourself and you're criticizing yourself and you're worried, am I good enough? Or, or when you're overwhelmed by negative emotions. So for instance, there's a lot of research showing that it reduces burnout and exhaustion. So I guess we could interpret that as saying that it energizes you.
Yeah, beautiful. And creates more resilience. That's fantastic.
I do want to not switch topics, but I know so many people, and probably on this call, are aware of your great work on parenting. You're really well known for, just really, I think you've changed a lot of people's view of parenting. And I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, in terms of your understanding of parenting, and without maybe getting in the specifics of secure attachment, you've looked at how parents relate to themselves, how they understand themselves, like with Mindsight and Insight, that impacts their children's development. So I wanted to ask you, what's your view on how self-compassionate parents are, how that might impact their children's development based on the way you think about these things?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great question. I grew up professionally, first in pediatrics, where I just was observing in home observations, how parents and kids were interacting. And then after adult psychiatry training and child psychiatry training, I decided to become a researcher. So in terms of the background of your question, so I'm trained in an area of, psychology that's a part of child development. And in particular, in child development, it's really looking at attachment. Now, attachment has 2 branches. One is in the personality research that is the work of Phil Shaver and Mario Michelintz are leaders in that. And that's a different application of the same concepts that has become popularized in ways that, unfortunately, that data, which is very reliable from the researchers and great work, doesn't match with our work in developmental attachment. I just want to point this out. So it's a little confusing when you read the popular translations, especially by writers who don't know the distinction between these 2 research fields, and just combine them because they don't actually go together. So I just want to say, full transparency, I'm trained as a developmental attachment researcher. Not the other group. And that group does excellent work. They're great. It's just different, just to differentiate them. Now, that being said, in developmental attachment, which John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth are the leaders of that. Mary Main was a major student of Bowlby's and Ainsworth, and she was my main teacher. Sadly, she just passed away recently. What Mary Main brought to the world was this incredible finding, was that the number one predictor of a child's security of attachment versus non-security wasn't what the parent went through as a kid, but if the parent had made sense of their childhood. So let's hold that phrase, making sense, just for a moment, because we'll see, does making sense correlate with self-compassion? So let's just hold that as a question in our mind. So just to stay with the field of developmental attachment. So when I first read about that in 1985, I was like blown away. You may have been at Berkeley then, I'm not sure, but that's when.
Yeah, I was.
So Mary Main, was one of your, I don't know if she was your professor, but she was at Berkeley with you.
She was at Berkeley, yeah.
Go Bears, and both my kids graduated from Cal. And I was just doing some stuff at Cal yesterday, at Cal's UC, University of California, Berkeley. So, Mary was able to show, and published it for the first time in 1985, that the making sense process was the number one predictor, even more robust than observing for a year the interactions of kids with their parents in terms of predicting what's called the infant strange situation, which was the gold standard of measuring attachment. Anyway, so when I heard about that, I wanted to know as much as I could about it. Why is making sense of your life the most robust predictor of the security of your child? And then the thing to just point out is that Alan Schroff, another student of Mary Main's, of Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby's, and a colleague of mine, what Alan was able to show in Minnesota was that your security of attachment was the best predictor of basically your outcome in how you dealt with your emotions, and how you had interpersonal relationships that were rewarding, and how you met your intellectual potential, all sorts of things like that. We didn't have a measure of self-compassion, but I'd love to know if there's any research on that. I'll bet you they're highly correlated.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised. So, so that's the framework. So I went on a journey, which ended up in a book called The Developing Mind, now in its third edition, which is to give a gift back to the two Marys, Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth, and to basically say, this is why making sense for the adult creates integration in their brain, even if non-secure attachment, which compromised integration in their brain, would leave them with a way of, if they didn't make sense, they would basically project that inner lack of integration, and we can talk about what that actually means, onto their child in the form of either disconnection or intrusiveness or terror, the three major forms of non-secure attachment. And with security, what we found, which is absolutely beautiful, and Mary Ainsworth was one of the first people to actually publish this, was that if you had horrible things happen to you, but you made sense of your life, your children would be securely attached. So all the worry that parents had, like, oh my God, if my childhood was bad, there's nothing I can do. When I learned this in 1985, and then ultimately became a researcher in that area and a clinician working in that area and then writing in that area, it was to say to parents, no, you can at any time make sense of your life, create more integration in your brain, because neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change, will create this kindness and compassion inwardly. And we would talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you make sense, is you say, oh, I did the best I could as a kid.
Yes.
I developed a feeling of shame and a belief I was defective. Oh, that was my armor to protect me from seeing my parents as unreliable, which I would have gone insane. So instead I went to shame. Oh, thank you, belief of being defective. I don't have to hold on to that. Or, I'm harsh on myself because my parents were harsh on me. Oh, I don't need to internalize the aggressor like that. All these ways are what we mean by the making sense process. And the narrative, the adult attachment interview that Mary Main created, which I'm trained in, is basically, and I asked Bessel van der Kolk this the other day, it's still, as far as Bessel knows, and as far as I know, and maybe you know something different than this, it's the only way to research-wise assess the difference between resolved trauma or unresolved trauma. And what the attachment world that I live in what we were able to show was that there's a totally different trajectory. If you're traumatized either by abuse or neglect and you resolve it, the trajectory for you and your children is this way. If you've had those same experiences and you don't make sense of them, you don't resolve them, the trajectory is this way. So that's when I got really activated to say, what's happening in the brain of that adult that lack of resolution versus resolution makes a huge difference. And what is resolving trauma? And that's where this whole integration thing comes in.
Yeah. And that's where I think the self-compassion, I think it's, it's more than that, but that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And so just for people listening, as a parent, this kind of really talks about when you give yourself compassion, you're really, really helping your child in their developmental trajectory in a way that's been shown by research. Okay,
Yeah.
and I want to talk about this topic, and then I want to be able to open it up to members to ask you questions. But one of the reasons, when I asked you to talk to my community, is so we can have a discussion about. So we got into a kind of a friendly, not really just not even a debate, but a discussion about the word self and self-compassion, because some of your work lately, which is brilliant, like this book Interconnected, and a lot of what you're doing lately, it's really pointing out the problems when we see ourselves as separate from the world, right?
Yeah.
And that's the idea of separation causes a lot of suffering. And I know you said that to me, Kristin, why do you call it self-compassion? And I said, well, Dan, if you don't like that, you can call that inner compassion. And, you seemed happy with that. But maybe if you're going to and I'm actually fine if you call it inner compassion and not self-compassion. I think there's some reasons why the word self can be useful. But maybe if you can just elaborate, because you're so firm about that. Like, Kristin, you must change your term to inner compassion. So just and there's a lot of reason. What's your reasoning behind that? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking the question. Thank you for being open to the discussion.
Yeah.
And let me just outline a couple things. I do a lot of work in the psychotherapy field, and I'm a member of the field of mental health, and I'm an active therapist, and as you've heard, I'm also an attachment trained researcher and study relationships, and because I'm also trained in neuroscience, during the decade of the brain, the 1990s, people were continuing, what had been said for thousands of years, actually, that the mind is only what the brain does.
Yeah.
So the first battle, just to outline, is that people would use the word mind as a synonym for brain activity.
Yeah.
And so in the field that I was being trained in, psychiatry, what that did for the pharmaceutical companies was make this reductionistic view that if anyone had mental suffering, it was a brain disorder. If anyone had a brain disorder, they needed a pill.
Right.
Ka-ching, ka-ching, right? Lots of money, lots of reductionistic thinking. So now this is now, the late 80s, early 90s, which is the beginning of the decade of the brain. I was asked to be a training director in psychiatry. So that was before this field of interpersonal neurobiology was born. But, I basically brought a bunch of scientists together, 40 scientists together, where we had to look, is the mind only brain activity? And the neuroscientists said, absolutely, we've proven that's true. Many of the psychologists and psychiatrists said, absolutely, it's true. I said, well, let's just keep an open mind about it. We don't say keep an open brain about it. Why don't we say that? What's the difference, So that was the first battle in the 90s, was to try to have the field of mental health stop equating mind with brain activity. Now, that was a big battle. So that was the 90s. And, The Developing Mind was a book to try to have a scientific Fort Knox that was unassailable to do that. And it seems to have some impact, I hope. The second thing then is that if the mind was created to the brain activity, if it wasn't that, what was the mind? And that's a whole nother long story. But the bottom line was to look at systems, and that in the 1980s, the field of mathematics had demonstrated that complex systems have something called emergence. So emergence is like the wetness of water would be an example. No single water molecule has wetness, but when elements of a system interact, something emerges from the interaction, not just from the components of the system. So that's what emergence is. It's kind of like synergy that Buckminster Fuller would talk about. Something greater than the sum of its parts is the whole, right? Okay. So now we're up in 2000, the developing mind is out. People like Steven Pinker are saying parents don't have any impact on kids. It's all genetics, genetics, genetics. So I was asked to debate, people who were saying that, and funding was being removed from high-risk families. It was a really sad time. It was nuts in many ways. And so as someone with one foot in academics and one foot in now the educational world, I had to stand up on a podium and say why relationships mattered, So in that decade, the big deal was to say that our mental health was dependent not just on what happened in our bodies, including our brains, but also our relationships. So relationships became super, super, super important to focus on 2000, 2010. And so the issue then was to try to defend these at-risk children, adolescents, young parents, families from governmental agencies which were looking for any excuse to remove funding, right? So this was like a big deal to say relationships are really crucial to mental health. So interpersonal neurobiology offered a definition of the mind. I'm not giving it to you here, but it was basically both embodied and relational as an emergent process. Mental health was when a mind creates integration within and between. So that's the simple way of summarizing all that. And then when 2010 happened and all the political stuff was happening, polarization, and people were getting addicted to screens and social media was coming up, and all these things were happening. The environment was already for 30, 40 years on a trajectory downward because humanity was destroying it. The relationship of humans to nature became super important to focus on in terms of our global health. And for me, what happened as a therapist was, and we may have a lot of disagreement about these wordings, but I'll say it, that since the 1960s, when the field of self-actualization and self-realization and self-development, self-this and self-that came out, we haven't actually seen much improvement in anything. But instead, the field of mental health, since it's been focusing on the individual as the source of all things mental health, it's been a huge problem. So then I realized, we need to, what are our words? And, Teilhard de Chardin years ago wrote about the noosphere, the atmosphere of knowledge that's expressed in linguistic symbols called words. And so then, while earlier it was about mind and about relationships, now it was like, what is this self thing? So I started doing a review of every research project I could find, including yours, on people using the word self. And for me, and this may be wrong and distorted, but for me, the word self, from a research point of view, an academic point of view, was referring to three things. It was referring to your subjective experience, your perspective, and your agency, how you're acting. And whether you're an anthropologist studying self, or a sociologist studying self, or a psychologist studying self, or a psychiatrist studying self, neuroscientist studying self, where's the self in the brain, all this stuff. It was always about subjective experience, perspective, and agency. Luckily, that spells the word SPA, so you can remember it. And I'm an acronym addict, so it satisfied my attention. So then I said, okay, well, if that's what self is, and if people are thinking that it's the main center of experience, is a simple way of summarizing that, and that's what you have an agency for, you stand up for it, then maybe that's why the world is going to trash. Maybe because humans think that their self in their body is what it's all about, rather than realizing that the self has an inner aspect to it. It has an interpersonal aspect in terms of relationships with other humans, and it has a larger nature relational aspect to it. And then when I started to word this in lectures or in writings before I wrote Interconnected, it was like, wow, how do people like use words around this? And in English, we didn't have the right thing. So I said, look, if you're really going to have an integrated self, it can't just be that self means what's going on inside your body. It can't. That's got to be a me, but yourself is also a we, whether it's the individual with other human beings or all of nature. Let's call that we. So then when I was looking at indigenous writings and I was looking at contemplative writings and poetry and all sorts of input, because we use this process called consilience, then I realized modern culture had been creating this view that self equals the individual. So had this opportunity to teach with the Dalai Lama many times. So His Holiness and I would kind of riff off of this in these meetings we would do. And he would say this was a part of Buddhist teachings to realize the self is not just the individual. And at the extreme, some people would say the self is an illusion. And then one of my students was a student of Thich Nhat Hanh's, and people were getting mad at me because I was saying, no, 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 there is an inner self, but there's also a relational self. And they say you're a dualist, which is kind of like an insult. So my student, Ellie, she says, Thich Nhat Hanh, he was still alive then, Thai, he said he would say those people yelling at you are non-dual fascists because they're the ones that are being non-dual, like saying there are dualists and non-dualists.
Yeah.
So she said, Thai would say that there's the relative and the universal. So the bottom line of all this is after writing the book Aware, where it was about consciousness and one proposal of the scientific view of where awareness arises from, it really became clear that when you drop into pure awareness, and people would get this in this practice I do called the Wheel of Awareness, and I had done it before the pandemic with 50,000 people in person, and people would get this feeling like not that the self was dissolving, but the self was expanding. So
Yes.
then I thought, wow, when people start feeling healthy, they start realizing their self is not defined by their skull or their skin, that the self is in other human beings. The self is in the trees around us. The self is all around us. So then I said, well, how do you word that? So it was me is the body, inner self. We is the relational self with humans and nature. So that's where the word mui comes from, MWE. And people are feeling this liberation. And I put mui, I was teaching at Richie Davidson's lab, and they were all excited about this and stuff. So I put the mui into some, phrasing that I learned from Richie and other people. Anyway, so then now we're like about 8, 9 years ago, then it became like, what if the splinter in the modern soul, and Kristin, forgive me if this feels too sharp, but what if the splinter in the modern soul in modern culture is the view that self is a synonym for the individual? What if that's why we're limping along, killing each other in genocides and wars, destroying Earth, being addicted to screens, all these pandemics we have, the poly crisis people talk about. What if it's actually due to one simple thing, that we use the word self to equal the individual? So then I was with you somewhere at maybe Esalen, we were teaching together. I said, Kristin, what about just call it inner compassion? Do everything you're doing. And anytime you mean self as an individual, just say inner self. So we can realize you have an inner self and you have a relational self. It's still important. Everything you do upholds, just the wording needs to be changed. And I don't know what you're going to do or not do. For me, and at the Mindsight Institute, we use the word inner compassion because we think your work is rad. We think it's fantastic. It's really for the larger noosphere. Can we remind humanity that the center of experience is not defined by your skin encased body? So whatever words that you and I can come up with, I think it's the word self. Let's expand it and just put a qualifier in front of it. When you mean the individual, just say inner self compassion. That's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to give a very brief response, and then I do want to open it up to members. But just, I mean, I totally hear you, and actually, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying. I think what I've been trying to do more lately is talk about, well, what does the self mean? And the way I'm approaching it is there's this when we have that sense of self that feels separate, that's when we suffer. So compassion is aimed at the self. It's aimed at the suffering that arises when we feel separate, we feel limited, we feel small, we feel inadequate. That's kind of what the compassion is aimed at. The beingness that's giving the compassion is not a self. That's what you would call this we.
Well, that is the self, though. That is a center of experience.
Okay, anyway, we could talk about this, and I think we'd have to do some work to figure out if we're coming at the same place. But that's the reason I kind of like, first of all, use the word self because it's easy. I think it's important to talk about what that means. But then there's just a lot of, it's really interesting, the idea of maybe interpersonal being both in both ends of the equation.
Say more about that.
Well, so it's interpersonal. The beingness that's giving the compassion is interpersonal, right? It's not separate. And I guess I was thinking of the beingness or the experience that where the suffering is, which is feeling limited, inadequate, wrong, overwhelmed. That's what I'm using the word self to describe, the self that suffers. And you might say it's an illusory self. But is that an individual self?
It's an inner self. That's an inner self.
But it's also not, it's an inner self, but it's also not separate. So there's non-separation both in both sides of the equation. But just so you understand, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And we can have a discussion one time about whether we can integrate them or not.